All right, welcome back everyone to day 3 of this ArchivesSpace Basics workshop. Today we're going to move away from resource records and we're going to start talking about digital object, agent, and subject records. But before we do that, we're going to go ahead and do a homework recap. So for those of you that submitted your questions in the homework feedback form, we're going to answer those first. And then if there are any questions that anyone else has about the homework, if you want to go ahead and drop those into the Q&A, we'll get to those too. But first, we're going to go ahead and dive into the questions that were submitted via the feedback form. To Nancy and Noah, is there anything you want to say before we dive into the questions? Otherwise, I'll just start reading.
Nope, we can just take questions.
Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. All right, the first question we got via the feedback form. Would you please explain where the tin type details should be placed? I put the information in the extent note field, but I am not sure if that is the right area.
So in the extent container summary field, if you had, for example, one tin type, and well, actually I would put it in the extent dimensions field probably. If you had like dimensions of the tin type, I might put it there. But if it's more about the care and feeding of the tin type, then I would put that probably in a physical description note in the notes area.
Thanks, Nancy. All right. The next question we had about homework, were we supposed to apply DAX to folder titles or only the series titles? Phrased another way, were we supposed to revise series titles according to DAX and strictly copy paste the rest of the table information for our RDE?
I think the intent of the homework was more just to give you a cheat sheet that would give you some pre-existing data to plug in. You could certainly choose to revise those series titles to BDAX, but that wasn't necessarily a requirement. The bigger question, of course, is to think it through as you're doing the homework, to say something like, well, if it were my own repository, what would I do? Is our practice to make folder and series titles conform to DAX? Or would we not? In my house, I usually don't mess with folder titles unless I have an absolute reason to. I don't have time, honestly. But series titles could conform to DAX, and certainly a collection title would. So this is, there's not really a right or wrong answer to this. If you did, it was probably an interesting exercise, but there wasn't a requirement for the homework to do this. We weren't gonna, there's no grade. So hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah, there's no grade. We're not checking behind you. All right, thanks, Nancy. Next question. Is creating instances the only way to generate a box list / inventory?
I've seen a number of ways of doing it. So there are, if you actually want to get that PDF or that XML that has, containers that potentially tie to locations, you do need to create them in the instances. I have seen other variations where, say, people will put the box information in a unit title and then say, so my unit title is box 1, and then they'll list the folders underneath that. We don't really encourage that because again, this is a big database. And it's really important, if you ever want to migrate data out of this, to use the data fields for the purpose for which they were intended. And the unit title isn't really intended for your container information. Now, clearly, everybody inherits things that they may or may not have preferred to have done. So I've seen occasions where that's happened, where people have gone in and say, if the unit title was box 1 or box 2, they've actually made an instance for those and put the box number down there as well. So they'd have something to tie a location or a box size to or something like that. So when they've done that, and I should say they've also gone through and done that at each of the component levels underneath them if they wanted to, but just so long as that box number was in the instances someplace, it gave them something to work with and potentially migrate in the future. So that's definitely the best way. The others are a workaround. I will say that right now, if you don't add instances and top containers as you're creating the components, You can certainly go back and add them later, but you have to open every single component in order to do that. And it is a horrible task to do it after the fact. With version 3 that's going to come out very shortly, I think there's a spreadsheet that will allow you to go back in and sort of batch add. It's sort of exactly, well, not exactly, but it's much like the spreadsheets that Noah showed last Thursday, so that you can add top containers to existing archivable objects. So that will make that process a lot easier, but they are, it's a pain to add them after the fact now.
Thanks, Nancy. And yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit more about version 3.0 later in the context of agents, because the majority of 3.0 and what that release does is update the agents module. So that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit. But there is a new spreadsheet that you can do, just like Noah showed, like Nancy said, where you can add containers after the fact. So 3.0 is out now, so there's no more waiting. We've gotten very used to saying like in the future, but it's out now and available, but we are still using 2.8.1 for this training. It came out during this training. All right, next question. If folders from more than one series are housed in the same top container, one needs to create a top container version for each series, i.e. box 1, series 1, box 1, series 2.
No, you do not have to do that. I think we mentioned it last week. It was a practice that had happened in a number of institutions, and so ArchivesSpace had to accommodate it when people migrated in. But I'm not sure it's actually an encouraged practice. I don't know of institutions still doing it, though I certainly wouldn't rule it out. I hardly know all institutions. So really, you should be able to use box 1 at any place in your inventory that you need to. The system knows. So if you're using it in series 1 and you're using it in series 2, you should just be able to pull up the same box 1 and then add the appropriate folder numbers as children. So you could have in series 1, box 1 appears and maybe it's folders 1 through 3. In series 2 would also just be box 1, but it might be folders 4 through 6. Does that make sense?
I'm not seeing any chats that scream no, so.
Give people a minute.
Yeah, pause. All right, thanks, Nancy. And again, if you have any follow-up questions, if one of these questions is yours, please feel free to follow up. Next question. Is there a way to keep track of what component unique identifier you are on / is next when entering files using the direct method?
I'm not entirely sure that I understand that question. The component unique identifier does not have to be used when entering, so we say that during entering archival objects directly. You might use the component unique identifier if you wanted to number a series or subseries. I've used it in-house in the past for, say, adding, if I'm like the Getty has a grant foundation, so sometimes I'll put the grant number in the component unique identifier or something like that, but it's certainly not something you fill in. And so, for example, if you're putting the folder number in here, that's the wrong place to put it. You'd want to put it down under instances as a child of your top container, unless your folder is an oversized folder, in which case it might be the top container. And I think there's a chat question. Oh, I see. There is a chat question. I'm going to go back for a second to that box 1, series 1 question. That series 1 just shows up because you probably entered series 1 in the component unique identifier. And so it was helping you to identify that it had been used there. And again, that's part of that holdover from people who had that descriptive practice. It does not mean that that box is only assigned to the series 1. If in this case, like the one that Noah is showing, this was a box 1 and ended up being used in 2 different series. So you didn't have to add the series. The system did it in an attempt to be helpful for certain descriptive practices, but I know it's confusing. But you don't need a separate box 1 for series 2. If you had assigned the box 1 to series 2, then that series 2 would have magically appeared at the end of box 1. And I know that that's confusing. It's for those repositories that used to renumber at that level, and I think most don't.
One sort of way I like to think about it with top containers is that in your entire ArchivesSpace database, you really only want to have one record for each like physical container that you have in your stacks or storage. So think of it that way, like this box 1 that I'm showing on the screen, I mean, it's a physical box that exists, and I should only create one top container record that refers to that same like physical box in my repository. And the series information is just kind of layered on there based on which, whether or not that box happens to be used in series 1 or series 2, etc., of any given collection.
Yeah, that's right. Each container should be unique in your system.
Yep.
It can be used in multiple places, but it should be unique in your system.
Thanks. All right, we had one more question submitted before the training. Is there a way to collapse the sections after you have added data? For example, after you add date and open the date section, can you close the section again after you've added the date information to save on scrolling?
Yeah, I can try to answer this one. So yeah, as you're seeing on the screen here, I'm in an Archival object record. And if I go down and I add a date record, it pops open this series of fields. And, you know, if I were to have entered in a date and save it, that date subrecord is always going to be kind of expanded like this. Within edit mode, there's no way to, you know, collapse this date section once it has data in it. This is different than collapsing, but you can remove it. You can remove the date subrecord altogether if you click this X box or button, and then you click confirm removal. That'll remove the subrecord, but you know, that's not hiding it. That's actually deleting it. But yeah, unfortunately, there's no way to kind of collapse information. If you remember, if you're looking at a component in view mode, let's see, if I go to view mode and I go to one of these, the sections will be collapsed by default. So, and you can collapse and uncollapse them in view mode, but you can't in edit mode. Hopefully that helps.
Thanks, Noah and Nancy. All right, that catches us up on the pre-submitted questions, and I haven't seen any coming in through the Q&A. We do have a few more minutes left for Q&A and homework recap. So if you do have some questions, I'm kind of stalling for time now to give you a chance to put them in. But if no one asks any additional questions, we will go ahead and move on to digital objects. And I am positive that digital objects could always use that extra time. So there's no problem there. No other questions. So that was me rambling for, I think, a long enough period of time. So Noah, if you feel ready, we can go ahead and move on to the digital objects portion of our day. So we're going to spend the entirety of the first half of our day together focusing on digital objects. So that's what we're going to be doing right up until break. So Noah, are you ready?
Yep, I'm good.
All right.
Great, and you all can still see my screen, web browser. Great.
Yep.
Yeah, as Jessica said, we're going to spend all of the time up until break talking about digital objects. I expect that this will generate some questions. There's a lot of variation in how institutions choose to implement the digital objects module in ArchivesSpace. There's probably more variety of institutional practice here than like any other area of the application. So, and I'll try to talk about why that is as we go through it. So before we dive into a demo of digital objects, how to create them, I thought it would be good to do sort of a high-level overview of how digital objects kind of work in ArchivesSpace and talk about some like concepts and use cases. So to do that, I made a few slides just to sort of for my own organization and maybe to make this a little easier to communicate. Let me present these. So yeah, some concepts and use cases. So just a reminder, and the workbook covers a lot of this, but ArchivesSpace is not a digital asset management system. So in ArchivesSpace, you can't upload and store digital files. So you can't, take a JPEG or a TIFF and upload it to ArchivesSpace and save it there and have it display in ArchivesSpace. That's just not functionality that is built into ArchivesSpace. It's strictly for managing metadata about digital objects. So ArchivesSpace then is not really a substitute for something like DSpace or Content DM or Fedora or Omeka or any other kind of repository or digital asset management system. And again, ArchivesSpace only manages metadata about digital files. It doesn't actually manage the files themselves. So what a digital object record can do in ArchivesSpace is really only refer or link to a digital file that is stored somewhere else, whether or not that somewhere else is a system or whether or not that somewhere else is just like a web server or some other public facing web storage. Whoops. And so there are a lot of possible ways that you could implement digital object records in ArchivesSpace. And this really depends on how you plan to integrate ArchivesSpace with other systems or with wherever you store your digital files. There's also a lot of possibilities around how granularly you want to describe your digital objects. So whether or not you want to kind of describe an object at like a single top level, or whether or not you want to have more complex digital objects where you sort of model the structure of them in ArchivesSpace. And we'll see kind of what that looks like in a minute when we talk about simple versus complex digital objects in ArchivesSpace. So before you start implementing or creating digital object records in ArchivesSpace, I thought that I'd list some questions that you might think about before implementing. So, and I think this is really important. So think really hard about what is your system of record for managing metadata about digital objects in your institution. One option might be that is ArchivesSpace. Another option is that you have another system, again, something like Content DM or DSpace or another repository platform. And then also think about what you really want to accomplish by creating digital object records in ArchivesSpace. And I've listed some sort of possibilities here, but some things that you can do. Digital object records in ArchivesSpace will let you link from published resource records to digital object files. You can do things like embed digital images in the ArchivesSpace public interface. Using digital objects records, you can kind of situate digital objects in the larger context of archival collections. Depending on how you decide to model your digital objects, you can think about how you want to communicate the structure and organization of your digital files. So for example, do you want to describe like each page of a digital object? If it's a, like a multi-page object, do you, for example, like, do you want to describe all the chapters in a digital book, something like that? And then another thing to think about is, would you want to use digital objects to allow reference archivists to be able to locate and retrieve digital files from storage if patrons discovered digital object records in the ArchivesSpace public interface. So these are all just kind of like things to think about as you're thinking about implementing the digital objects module. And so based on all of those kind of factors swirling around, the workbook kind of identifies these two primary use cases for digital objects in archive space. And these are the two that we'll sort of cover in the workshop. The first use case assumes that archive space is your system of record for all digital object metadata. So that's, really, you don't have some other system that has metadata about your digital objects. You're going to do it all in archive space. And so in this use case, your files are stored just on a network somewhere or some other web accessible location. And then all of your descriptive and structural metadata about digital objects is going to live in archive space. The second use case, and this one I find is, in my experience, much more common. It's definitely the use case that applies to us at Duke, but this use case is that you have some other system of record for your digital object files and digital object metadata, whether or not that's a repository or some other kind of digital asset management system or exhibit software. In this use case, your files and metadata about those files are stored in some other repository or system. And then digital object records in archive space are really only used for linking out to those records or files in another system and for sort of situating digital objects in the larger kind of intellectual arrangement of archival collections that you describe in archive space. So again, in this use case, the digital object serves two purposes. It links out to the files and it kind of communicates to the researcher how that digital object kind of fits into the, the hierarchy of an archival collection. Okay. I think that's all of the sort of high level conceptual stuff I wanted to cover, and we'll sort of see how this plays out when we start to look at how digital objects work in archive space. So what we're going to do is we're going to mock up some digital objects. Before I get started with that, I'm going to show you, there are a couple of different ways that you can create digital objects in archive space. And this is like many of the other record types. You can either create digital objects directly using this create dropdown. So if I go to create and I click on digital object, I'm going to get a new digital object record form to fill out here. I'm not going to go over all these fields right now, but just you can see here that this is what a digital object kind of data entry form looks like. If I were to fill out these fields and save this record, what I would have is a kind of a standalone digital object that just exists in archive space, but it's not linked to any other record. So that's one way to create digital objects. Another way to create them is you can browse to any given resource record. So let's go to our Krispy Kreme example. You can browse to your resource record and then browse to any sort of level of the record where you want to link a digital object. So I was playing around with this record last night, and I noticed this Krispy Kreme Corporation records, and I noticed that there's this subseries for retail shops and plants. And if I was scrolling through here and I noticed that there's a particular file here for one Krispy Kreme store on Bardstown Road in Louisville, Kentucky. And this is where I'm from. And this is the actual Krispy Kreme store that I grew up going to. So I'm going to use this for our example. But one way you can, another way to create digital objects is to navigate to a component record, to an archival object. And then if I scroll down, I see the kind of metadata about this archival object. And if I scroll down to the instances section of it, we can see that there's already a container instance here. So this physical photograph exists in folder 46 of box 19 in this collection at the Smithsonian. But let's kind of pretend I also have a digitized version of this photograph. What you can do is you can add a digital object as an instance of an archival object. So if I click Add Digital Object, I get this little pop-up area of this sub-record that pops up down here. And from here, what I can do two things. I can either search for a digital object that I've already created in ArchivesSpace. So if I sort of started searching for something, it's going to look up, it's going to find digital objects that already exist in ArchivesSpace that match whatever I'm typing. So the only Krispy Kreme one in here right now is this videotape, which is kind of not what I want. But if I did want to link to this digital object, I could click this and then save this archival object. And then I've kind of established this link to an existing archival object. But if I want to create a new archival object in the context of a resource record, I can use this drop down and then click and then choose create. And then I get this same data entry template that we saw when we tried to create a digital object from scratch. It's the same fields are available to you. It's just when I do it, when I click create within the context of a resource record, whenever I finish filling this out and I click create and link, it's going to do two things. It's going to create this digital object, save it, and then it's also going to link the digital object to this resource record all at the same time. So this is kind of a handy way to do two things at once. So let's walk through some of the fields that are available to us for digital object records. The only two required fields for a digital object are the title and the identifier. We can tell again because both of these fields have this red asterisk next to them, which notes that that's a required field. Let's talk about identifiers first. So identifiers for digital objects can really be anything. There's no sort of required format. The tooltip here recommends that you use an arc or a handle or a URI, but that is not sort of absolutely required. I could have an identifier that's something like ABC123. It could be anything that uniquely identifies this digital object in your institution. One requirement though is that identifiers must be unique within ArchivesSpace. So I could not create another digital object record that has the same identifier. If I created another one that said ABC123, it wouldn't let me save it in the system. So let me pause here. What I'm going to do in the demo here is I'm actually going to pretend, if I back out again, keep in mind that I'm looking in a resource record. I'm in the Krispy Kreme Corporation records. I'm on this archival object component here that describes this folder full of digital images of this particular Krispy Kreme store on Bardstown Road in Louisville. Because I don't have access to these actual digital files that the Smithsonian has, what I'm going to do is kind of pretend that I do. And so I found a photograph on Flickr of this particular store, and a Krispy Kreme store in Louisville. So I'm just going to use this photo as my digital object. And so in this case, if we go back to think back to the use cases slide that I showed, in this case, I'm kind of assuming that Flickr is my digital asset management system that manages my image files. I don't know that I would recommend that you use Flickr as your digital asset management system, but it can work perfectly well. So just imagine, if this wasn't Flickr, it might be some other repository or exhibit type system that you have for managing images in your institution. But Flickr is nice to use as an example because it actually allows us to get different sizes, to access different sizes of images. And we'll see why that's kind of useful here in a little bit. What I'm going to do, I'm looking at this image in Flickr. I can kind of tell if I look at the URL. This isn't my photo. This is this guy, Don Snegowski's photo, and he's said that we can use it. It has a CC license, so we're good to go there. But I'm going to just copy this, what looks to be an identifier out of the URL. And I'm going to go back down here in my instances section. I'm going to go to create a digital object again. I'm going to throw that identifier into this identifier field. So here, this isn't a URL. It's just a unique identifier that identifies this photograph in some way in Flickr. Uh-oh, what happened? I lost my photo. There we go. So the title, I'm just going to grab the title that he's given this thing in Flickr, which is Krispy Kreme at Nightfall. And I'm going to paste that into my title field. Those are the only two required fields. I could save this record right now and ArchivesSpace would let me do that. I'm going to go ahead and click this publish checkbox, which means that in the ArchivesSpace public interface, this digital object record will be published. And that just means the metadata about it will be published, not the actual image, but we'll see what this does. So if I click the button to create and link the digital object, what it did is it created that new digital object in the digital objects module, and then it linked it to this component record here, this Krispy Kreme or this Bardstown Road record. In order to actually save this link, save this relationship that I've established between this component and the digital object, I still have to click the Save Archival Object button. So I save that archival object. And now if I kind of scroll back down to the instances section, you can see, I've got this box folder instance, and then I've got this digital object instance. If I were to actually click this View Published button here, I'm going to do that and open it up in a new browser tab. So this kind of jumps me over to the ArchivesSpace public interface. And so this is what you would see. This is what a researcher would see. If I'm looking at this component in the public interface, you can see I'm in the Krispy Kreme Corporation records and the photograph series and retail shops and plants subseries, and I'm on this component here. If I scroll down, you'll see now there's this section down here called digital material. And if I open that, it lists the digital object record that I just created. And so if I click on that, what it does is it jumps me over to a page that represents just this digital object record in ArchivesSpace. And so here we have the title of that digital object. We have its identifier, the one that I pasted in. And then we can see in this linked record section that this digital object is associated with this collection. And this is kind of the level of the hierarchy where this digital object lives. One thing you won't see here, there's no image, obviously. There's also no link. There's no way to actually get to this image. And so I think this is kind of an important thing to point out. If you want to actually provide a link to the digital object or make a thumbnail or some version of the image show up in ArchivesSpace, there are a couple of additional things that you have to do. And so let's look at what those things are right now. So I'm going back to the staff interface, and I'm back inside my resource record. While I'm up here in the tree view here, you can notice that now in the this list view, I see that this component has a mixed materials kind of container instance, but also has a digital object instance. This is a nice little kind of quick way to scroll through a collection and see which things have digital objects linked to them and which don't. But if I scroll down to the bottom again, you'll see I still have this digital object. There are a couple of ways I can open up this digital object and edit it. I can either click this blue kind of link area and then click view. It opened up that object in another tab, that digital object. And now what I'm seeing is just this digital object record, and I could go in and edit it here. That's one option. Just to show you, you can also sort of search for digital objects from the home screen. So here I did a search for the title of that digital object. I get 2 search results. One of those search results is the digital object record itself. And here it tells me that this digital object exists. Whoops. This digital object exists in this particular component. The second result here is actually the result for the archival object that digital object is linked to, if that makes sense. And you can sort of see the position of that archival object in the hierarchy of that Krispy Kreme Corporation records. So if I wanted to edit this digital object, I could also go in, I could search for it and then open it up in edit mode from the search results screen. So again, just a couple different ways you can find digital objects after you've created them. And so now what we're going to do, because, you know, if you remember when we were looking in the public interface, we weren't able to see or link to that digital object in Flickr. If we actually want to be able to link out to it, what we have to do is we have to fill out what's called a file version subrecord. So if I click add file version right here, you'll see I get kind of a new set of fields that show up in this subrecord. Just to explain kind of what a file version subrecord is, if you hover over file version, this tooltip is going to tell you that file version records are kind of intended to be used to allow you to refer to the actual content file that you've described in your digital object. And so here we're just describing this digital object kind of intellectually. We've said this is the title of it and this is its identifier. But here is where we're actually saying where the file itself lives. So where does this image file itself live? Or where does the sort of record for this image file live? And so the only required field in this file version subrecord is the file URI field. And so here is where you would enter a URI that, you know, will let you link to that image. And so what we're going to do is we're going to grab just this link from Flickr that includes this identifier. And we're going to paste it, whoops. We're going to paste it into this file URI field. And then we're going to go ahead and click the publish box, just noting that we want this information to be published to the public interface. And then you see there are some additional fields here. And let's go through these and kind of talk about what they're used for. So there's this use statement field. This gives you kind of a drop-down menu of options that refer to sort of what role this file version plays in the context of your digital object. So some examples here help make this make a little bit more sense. So you could say that this URL kind of is a thumbnail image, or it's a master image, or maybe it's OCR text of the digital object. So these are just some options you have. I'm going to choose image service just for this one because Flickr is kind of a service that provides images, renders images. So I'm just going to choose image service. Don't worry too much about kind of what this means. There's some additional fields. Let's go on down. So there's this field that's titled Xlink Actuate attribute. That's kind of a mouthful. What this is actually referring to is a particular attribute in encoded archival description that has this label. So this kind of is a legacy of when they designed ArchivesSpace, they kind of modeled it based around the EAD standard, and that's kind of why you have some of these fields. But this field has some drop-down values, and so in this case, we're going to choose, I'm just going to choose on request, which means when I publish this digital object record, I want when somebody clicks on the link, when they request it, I want it to actually jump out to Flickr. And then there's another field called Xlink show attribute. And this is a way for you to kind of communicate what you want to happen when somebody clicks on that link. Do you want it to show up in a new browser window? Do you want it to replace the existing browser window, etc.? I'm going to choose new here. And then let me go through these really quickly. There's a file format name dropdown. This is where you can, if you want to, include information about the kind of file it is. Is it a JPEG file, a plain text file, etc.? This information is not required. I'm actually going to leave it blank for the sake of this example. If you wanted to provide like your own kind of free text note about the file format version, you could do that here. So say, you know, this is PDF version 2.6 or something, and you want to record that here, you can do that. File size in bytes, you know, I could say this is 12 megabytes or something. If you're kind of working with born digital records, or you otherwise want to save checksum values in ArchivesSpace, there's a field for that. And then there are various, for those of you familiar with sort of checksum methods, these are the available methods that ArchivesSpace kind of recognizes. So you could choose the one that you use to generate the checksum. And then finally, there's this kind of caption field where you can provide a little bit more of a caption for that file version if you want. I'm just going to leave all these blank just to show you that they're not really necessary unless you want to provide that information. So let's go ahead and save this digital object with this new file version. I'm going to click publish all just to make sure that every part of this digital object is published. And then I'm going to go back to the ArchivesSpace public interface. And so, so now I'm in this kind of public facing finding aid. I've navigated down here to this component. And now, instead of only seeing the digital object information down here in this digital materials section, I also get this little icon right here at the top of the record, this kind of generic icon that indicates that, hey, there's a digital instance of this component. And if I hover over it, you can kind of see it's clickable. And so now if I click on this generic icon and I open it up in another browser tab, it links me directly to that page in Flickr. So again, imagine that this could be, you know, a link to a record in your repository somewhere, or a record to, you know, something on your website. So we were able to make this show up by adding that file version record. So if we want to kind of take it one step further, one more level of complexity, let's say instead of this generic icon, that we actually want to embed a thumbnail image of this photograph in ArchivesSpace itself, in the public interface. And we also want that embedded thumbnail to be clickable, so that if somebody clicks it, they can jump out to this kind of record for this photograph in this other system. So I'll kind of show you how you can go about doing that. So I'm going to look for this digital object again. I'm going to search for it. Here it is. I'm going to open it up in edit mode again. If I scroll down, remember I created this one file version with a link to Flickr. And this is a link to, this is an important distinction to make here. This is a link that links to this page in Flickr. It doesn't actually link to this image itself. It links to this page in Flickr where this image is kind of served up. I got lost here. Sorry, y'all. There we are. If I want to now add a thumbnail version of this image and embed it directly in the ArchivesSpace public interface, what I can do is I can add another file version. So I can do this by either clicking this add file version button, or I can click this plus box or plus button right here. And then it's going to open up another set of fields for my second file version. And let's say what I want to do here is provide a URL that points to a thumbnail sized version of this image. And so if I go to Flickr, Flickr has this kind of handy feature where it lets you over here on the right download various sizes of an image. So what I'm going to do is sort of right click this small size, and then I'm actually just going to copy the address of that link to that small image. And I'm going to paste that link into my file URI field. So again, this is a link to the small sized image in Flickr. You can see it's got, you know, .jpeg at the end. I'm going ahead and going to say that I want to publish this. And then if I fill out a few of these additional fields, I can say, in this case, this file version refers to a thumbnail. So I'll choose image thumbnail. And I can say that I want this image thumbnail to show up on load when the page is loaded. And I want it to be embedded in the page, in the public interface. I can choose embed. So now that I've filled out these fields in my second file version, so again, just to kind of reiterate, I've got my top level kind of description of the photo. I've got one file version that refers to the page in Flickr where this image lives, or where it's described in Flickr. And then I've got a second file version that refers just to the thumbnail size version of it. And if I save this digital object, make sure I'm publishing it again. And now if I go back to the ArchivesSpace public interface, and if I refresh my page, fingers crossed, now instead of that generic icon, I actually have a small thumbnail sized version of this image that shows up within my ArchivesSpace public interface, as part of this archival object component record. I can see the title of that digital object here. And now if I hover over the digital object, the image, I can see that it's clickable. And so if I click on it, it's going to jump me out to Flickr or out to my other system that kind of manages where these images are. All right. So that was kind of a lot of stuff going on there, but I just wanted to show you that you can do quite a bit with digital objects in ArchivesSpace, but it really depends on how you plan to use it in relation to another system that you might have. So we could imagine a scenario like where we don't have something like Flickr. We just have a file that is like saved on the web somewhere. In that case, we could just have a single file version that embeds that image within ArchivesSpace. That's something that we can do. If you want, when you're working on the homework for this section, if you have a repository or some system in your institution, or if you have image files somewhere, play around with creating file versions for them and see how they display in the ArchivesSpace public interface to get a sense for sort of how this works. One other thing I wanted to show related to digital objects before we end. So everything that I just showed you in this particular digital object I created is what the workbook refers to as a simple digital object.
Noah?
Yes.
Before you jump to complex,
yeah,
maybe answer a couple of questions.
Yeah, sure.
Knock those out yet. So Nancy has been answering questions in the Q&A. So if you put a question in the Q&A and Nancy answered it, make sure you check out the answered section. And someone did specifically ask about what you're about to do, but I want to go ahead and answer some of the other questions first. So we have a couple questions related to the identifier. So can you use the images content DM identifier for the digital object identifier? Is that okay?
Yeah, that should be fine, as long as those content DM identifiers are sort of absolutely unique, because ArchivesSpace, again, won't let you create two digital objects with the same identifier. But yeah, that should be perfectly fine. And if we used to use content DM, if I'm remembering right, it provides some sort of internal, database number, something like this, that you could use.
All right, and then so can the identifier on the digital object be the same as the ref ID for the archival object?
That's a good question. I believe so. I would have to test that, but I'm pretty sure it can be. There's no, as far as I know, there's no rule against duplicating a ref ID as an identifier. And so if you had just to maybe make that question make a little more sense.
I just tried it because I saw that question, so I went to test it before I fully answered, but it saved the record if I just plug the ref ID in. So I think it just has to be unique within this module.
Yep. Yeah, so if I actually go to the archival object, just so everyone knows what we're talking about when we talk about ref IDs. So I'm on this archival object, and you'll see that there's this ref ID field here, and it has this number in it, ref 395. When you're creating new archival objects in ArchivesSpace, your ref IDs won't look like this. They'll be like a longer string, like a UUID. but just know that when we talk about ref ID, that's what we're talking about. So we could take this ref ID and we could plug it into this identifier field, and it's going to let us save it, yeah, without any problem. And so this, I mean, this could be nice if you have like a, you know, your digitization workflow is that you take a folder and you scan everything in that folder and create a digital object for it, and you just want like this to be the file name of that folder's worth of digital objects. Yeah, that's a perfectly reasonable scenario, I think, at least.
All right. Getting some other questions that are sort of bigger questions. So let's wait to answer those until Noah's done also showing complex digital objects. But one other question that's in the chat, is there a way to deal with, for example, you're using a link to a page on Flickr. Is there a way to deal with broken links over time for those external web pages?
Yeah, that's a good question too. There's nothing built into ArchivesSpace that is going to periodically check your links to make sure they're not broken. Having said that, there are techniques for looking for broken links, not in ArchivesSpace, but just, you know, kind of generally there are, you know, applications or scripts that will let you do that. And if you had some comfort level with scripting around the ArchivesSpace API, or, you know, somebody in your institution had that kind of, you know, skill set, they could fairly easily, you know, just read over all your digital objects, like look at all the links and make sure that they're still working. That's actually something that we don't have that in place at Duke right now, but it's something that I've looked into a little bit. But it's a really good question, because yeah, stuff breaks all the time. If you migrate to a new system and all of your links to your digital objects change, you'd have to update them all. Not direct answer to your question, but I would recommend that you, as much as possible, try to create kind of persistent identifiers for your digital objects, whether or not that's using like a handle system or an arc. Arcs are just kind of universally unique identifiers that you can assign to digital objects. And that way you can kind of move objects around in different systems, but they'll retain those permanent IDs. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer.
Thanks, Noah. All right. I'll go ahead and turn it back over to you since we only have 15 minutes.
Sure. Yeah, the last thing I wanted to show, and I won't spend a whole lot of time on this just because in my experience, this is an infrequent use case that you'll want to do this, but whoops. I'm going to show you what a complex digital object looks like in ArchivesSpace. Everything that we just saw was a simple digital object. So there's actually one of these in the system already. If you all are kind of following along in your own instance, you can search for this letter from Julia Child. Whoops. Letter from Julia Child to Jedediah Horcrux Congreve. Terrible name. So what you see here is a complex digital object. And if you remember from last week, this looks a lot like what we saw when we were adding children to resource records. So here, I'm still in the digital objects module. I can tell because, you know, I've got digital objects in this breadcrumb trail here. But in this case, this digital object has kind of a top level record that describes the digital object kind of intellectually. It's got a title, it's got an identifier, it's got some other bits of metadata here. This digital object actually has kind of a lot more description. It has language field filled out. It has dates. We didn't we didn't fill out these fields when we were mocking up the Krispy Kreme record, but it's got agent links. It could have subject headings associated with it. This digital object has 6 note fields. Again, all of these fields are also available for digital objects if you want to use them. But we have, in this case, we have this top level record, but we also have these 2 child components of this digital object. And so the first component, first child, refers to just the first page of this digital object. And if we look at this child component record, digital object record, you can see the child component actually has a file version that points to, the image file for page 1. And then it has some information about that image file. And if I clicked on the page 2 component, it has a file URI file version that points to the image for page 2. And so in this way, if you want, again, this is totally optional, but functionality that exists, you can build multi-level kind of hierarchical digital objects. So if I wanted to add, a page 3, I could click add sibling, and I could type, page 3, and then I could add a file version, that refers to, I don't think there actually is a URL for page 3, but if we just pretended, we could do something like this, say that's where the page 3 JPEG lives, and we could save it. And we could continue adding additional components for each page of this digital object, and each component would link to a separate image or a separate file. It doesn't have to be an image. It could be an oral history audio. It could be a video file. It could be anything. As Nancy was showing last week, all of the kind of functionality you have for moving components around. So, if I want to enable reorder mode and I want to put page 3 before page 1, I don't know why I'd want to do that, but that's something you can do. You essentially have all of the same functionality for creating and rearranging digital object components as you do with resource record components. And the interface looks very, very similar. Just to show you, if you want, you can have more than one level of hierarchy. If I actually want, say page 1 of this digital object, say there's like I don't know, like a photograph stuck on that page, and then I scanned that photograph separately, I could add like a child of page 1, and I could say like, tipped in image or something like that. So here I've got like 3 levels of hierarchy. I've got my top level digital object, I've got page 1, and then another child component. An easier way to, probably better way to illustrate this would be like, say you were digitizing a book and you wanted to represent like that the book had chapters as like the next level, and then each chapter had a series of pages, and you had imaged like all of those pages separately. ArchivesSpace will allow you to sort of model that structure of a digital object, of a complex digital object, and then provide links to all of the various files as part of that complex digital object. So just to show you, we can look at, if we go back to the top level of this and we make sure it's all published, we can jump over and look at what this digital object looks like in the public interface. So here is what we're seeing here is just the page for this digital object. I can tell because I've got digital objects in the URL path. But within this digital object itself, I can kind of navigate all of the components of it over here. So this is page 1. I clicked on page 1, and now I can click to view page 1 of that digital object. That's what I'm seeing there. If I want to go to page 2, I can click page 2. And then I can click to see page 2 of that digital object. So again, this is how you can model and display complex kind of hierarchical digital objects in ArchivesSpace. And the reason you would do this in ArchivesSpace is really if you were kind of following that use case 1 example that we talked about on the slides, where like you don't have another system that manages the structure of digital objects. You don't have another system that manages this, relationships between pages. And you want to do all of that kind of modeling in ArchivesSpace. ArchivesSpace will let you do that. So just know that that's something you can do. If you had a repository that is able to organize things into pages or apply some other level of structure, I think it is incredibly overkill to also do that in ArchivesSpace. So what I would do in that situation is just create a simple digital object in ArchivesSpace that points out to that object in your other system, and then let that other system kind of deal with the structure, assuming that it is equipped to handle that kind of thing. But ArchivesSpace, again, is flexible enough to kind of meet a bunch of different kinds of needs. We saw most of that in the demo. There's a few additional things that you can do that we're not able to cover in the workshop, but I think that's a pretty good overview of how digital objects function. And I don't know if there are any questions that folks have dropped in the chat.
Thanks. Yeah, there are 2 questions that I think it would be worth answering live, and we only have 5 minutes. But
Okay.
The first is if you have a link to a scan of an item within your repository that's already described within your finding aids or in your resource record, can you talk a little bit about how you would link those 2 things together?
Okay. Can you read that one more time?
All right. So that was me paraphrasing it. So I did
No,
bad.
that's all right.
Okay, so the question is it necessary to make 2 versions of a file URI if it's a link to a scan of an item within the repository, which is already described within the finding aid? I think it's the question is, how can I add a digital object instance to an Archival object?
Yeah. Yeah, I think, there are a couple of different things maybe going on with that question, but let's see if we could kind of mock up an example. There's nothing to prevent you from. So the example that I showed, the Krispy Kreme example, is like we had a folder full of like physical images that had been scanned, and so in that case we had. Let me go back to that. In that case, we had. Where are you, Kentucky? We had 2 instances. We had like a physical instance and a digital instance. You can create an archival object record that only exists digitally, so this, like, we could assume, for example, that like this one maybe we don't have like a physical photograph. It was a born digital photograph, and we could describe it in the resource record just like we would describe physical things. And then instead of having this, we can pretend that this container instance didn't exist. We could add a digital object instance that only refers to the digital version of it. And then within that digital object, we really only need to have one file version with a link that would link out to it. And so if we sort of look at what this looks like in the public interface, so I'm in the, let me save this real quick. I'm in the resource record, staff interface. I click view published. I don't know why there are two showing up here, but there should only be one. Yeah, it's just an indexing lag time. But now, yeah, all we see, we don't have a folder instance for this thing. We just have the link to the digital object. And if I click on it, it's just gonna it's gonna give me a 404. But it should actually go to wherever that image file is, assuming that that link was constructed correctly. I hope that answers the question.
If they need to follow up.
Yeah.
All right, we only have 1 minute left. So, and Nancy has answered this in a little in the chat, but it's probably worth having a discussion. So if people need to go ahead and go to break, that's fine. We're going to break at 15 minutes after the hour, or maybe a couple minutes after, and we're going to come back at 1:30 p.m. Eastern, 30 minutes after the hour. That's going to be our break. But there is a question in the chat. If you have all of that description, dates, extents, notes in the resource record describing the physical item, is there a reason you would also want to add it to the digital object? Is that redundant?
Yeah, that's a great question. It depends on, it depends is the answer, but I would say like just to describe the way that we kind of treat digital objects is because we have another system where we have most of the kind of canonical metadata about digital objects. Our digital object records are really, really basic. We have a title field, an identifier, and then we have a single file version that just points to the record in the repository. If you have described that thing intellectually in your resource record and you've provided subject headings for it, and any other like note fields in your resource record, and you really just want to be able to link to a digital object, there, in my opinion, it's not necessary to provide like the same note fields and the same other fields in your digital object as you already provided in the resource record. So you can think about the digital object in that case is like it literally is just an instance of the thing that you described in your resource record. It's not like a separate intellectual object. It's almost just another container. It just happens to be digital, if that makes sense.
Thanks, Noah.
Sure.
All right. I think that all the other questions have been addressed either by text or just you answered them as you were presenting. So we're going to go ahead and go to break. We're going to take what's now a 14-minute break. We're going to come back at 30 minutes after the hour to start covering agents and subject records. We will have time to wrap up at the end. So if you have any last-minute digital object questions, we can ask them at the end of the day too. But I'll see everybody in 14 minutes. Thanks. All right, welcome back, everyone. We're going to get started with the last hour of our time together today. Before we get rolling, Nancy, are you here? Let's just confirm Nancy's here.
I'm here. I have to remember
Okay,
to
good. Okay, all right. I'm gonna just wanted to make sure I didn't start talking and then say, and over to Nancy, and you were not there. Before we get started talking about managing agents in ArchivesSpace, I'm going to take a little bit of time to talk about the differences between what you're seeing and experiencing in this training using ArchivesSpace version 2.8.1 and what the newest version of ArchivesSpace, which actually has come out since our training began, which is ArchivesSpace version 3.0, what those differences are. So for ArchivesSpace version 3.0, the primary focus of this new release is an expanded agents module. So there are some other things you've heard us refer to, like the container inventory spreadsheet that are part of that, but the primary focus of this release is expanding that agents module. So I'm going to talk for just a few minutes. I'm not going to demo anything because I don't want to muddy the waters between me talking about a thing you're not using and the thing that Nancy is going to be showing you today. But this is just so maybe if you're thinking about updating and you want to know what the differences are, or if you haven't, maybe you haven't implemented agents yet in ArchivesSpace, this is something to think about as you make your plans. After I talk, I'm going to drop a couple of things into the chat. I'm going to drop some links. I'm going to drop a link to a webinar that we did earlier this year in anticipation of this release. So it talks more about what this expanded functionality is. I'm going to drop a link to maybe you're ready to roll and you want to download it. I'm going to drop a link to that release so you can download it if you want. And then I'm going to drop 2 links to 2 different things in the Help Center. So again, if you are an ArchivesSpace member and you have already created your Help Center account, those links will work. If you have not created your Help Center account, they will not work, but you can do that through the link that's provided on your agenda. All right, so ArchivesSpace version 3.0, it's a huge change to the agents module. It makes agents more standards compliant with EAC CPF and Mark XML format. So it enables better data authority and enables like deeper and richer description of your people, families, and corporate entities and their relationships to each other. There are significantly more fields. There's just a lot more that you can do with agents now. So what you're going to see today is it's still a robust record. It's not really stripped down or anything, but it is much smaller in comparison to what you will see with the full record mode in the 3.0 version going forward. It has 5 main sections of the agent record. So you can record basic information, record control information, identity information about the person, family, corporate body, or software, descriptive information, and then relational information. So better describing those relationships within agents. I'm not going to talk too much about what all these fields are, because again, I don't want to muddy the waters, but I am going to drop that link to the Help Center that describes those fields better. The main thing I want to point out, the difference between what Nancy is showing you and what 3.0 does, is that because the record is so much more robust, you may prefer to look at a more streamlined version that is more similar to what Nancy's about to show you, and that is possible within 3.0. You will have the option within 3.0 of viewing a full, what we're calling full mode record of agent record, or a light mode agent record. So as a user, you'll look at the agent record, and there will be a toggle at the top that will give you the option to either view the record as full or view the record as a light mode record. So you won't have to see all of those fields if you don't want to use them. However, to enable that full or light mode, and this is a difference between there's no other record that is managed in this way right now in ArchivesSpace, so I wanted to point it out. To enable this full and light mode toggle ability for your users, that is something that if you're a repository manager or your sysadmin, they will have to go in and turn it on so to make that functionality available. And the way they would do that, if you remember all the way back to last Tuesday, we showed you user permission groups for managing your users and what they're able to do. They would do that by selecting the work with agents in full mode permission group. So or permission for a group of people. So you may decide at your institution that maybe certain permission groups don't need to have access to the full mode, so you don't turn that on for them, but some do, so you do turn it on for others. So those are the main differences between what you're about to see in version 2.8.1 and 3.0. But if I'm forgetting anything, Nancy and Noah, let me know, and I'm going to go ahead and start dropping those resources into the chat. So be sure to check those links out. Is there anything else to point out, Nancy, before I turn it over to you?
I don't think so.
All right. Well, I will let you, everybody go ahead and forget everything I just said. And Nancy is going to show you agents as of version 2.8.1.
Okay, so I'm going to share screens here. And just in case, hopefully you can't hear this, I have chickens. One of them, I think, just laid an egg and she's being very vocal about it. So if you hear a chicken, you're not crazy. Hopefully you can't hear her. But boy, I sure can. Anyway, I'm going to start sharing screens, and Okay, is this big enough? Let me know if I need to increase the size as we go. Feel free to jump
Nancy,
in, Jessica.
I think maybe a little bit bigger. If I remember, I think just a little bit larger might help.
Oops. No, not that. Is that better?
That's good. Yeah, that's better for sure.
Okay. So we're going to start. We're going to talk about agents. I think probably in your navigations over the last week or so, you've probably seen some of them already. There are some in the system. So I just want to point out to start that you can, there are a couple different ways of creating agents in the system. One of them is, of course, through this create drop-down menu, and you can create each of the 4 available types. I'm just going to show you this as a reminder. This is one way that you can do it, because we're actually going to create them in a couple of different ways. I'm going to spend a little bit more time there. We're actually going to start with agents, and then we're also going to cover subjects and hopefully be done by about 1/4 past the hour for questions, although I might creep over just a little bit, and I apologize if I do. So this is the base create screen, but what I actually want to start with is pointing out in the browse screen under agents, some of the material that's already here. So the way that some of these came in may have been through the initial create process, which one can do. But in many cases, it's not uncommon when people initially establish an ArchivesSpace application in their in-house that they start loading in EAD finding aids. And this is something Noah's going to show you when we talk about imports on Thursday. So I won't cover it there. But as a part of that data population, it's quite common for finding aids to have existing creators or controlled value headings and things like that. And so those come in and populate. So even after you've loaded a few in, you might start seeing a bunch of agents show up. And when you're on the browse screen, you can see over on the side the different agent types: person, corporate entity, family, and software, and some of the available sources. Of course, the sources are a configurable drop-down list, so you can add more as you need them. There are also a number of rules that are here, and you can sort and filter by any of these. You can also sort and filter here because it's blue. This is the predominant sort of these names, but you can sort and filter on any of these headings if they sort of turn color when you hover over them. There is a view and an edit mode. We're going to look at both of those in a minute. What I want to point out first, though, and of course this won't apply to everybody, but for those it applies to, it's really important. This is, in our test bed, we have multiple repositories. So we would call this a multi-repository application. Agents, actually I'm going to bounce back over here to browse for a second. And you see this line across the field? For each repository, the accessions, resources, and digital objects are unique to that repository. People working in other repositories can't see them. The same thing is not true of subjects, agents, container profiles, and events. Those are shared across repositories in a multi-repository environment. So for example, what this can mean is if I pull up, I'm going to go to, I think, this one, and open it in view mode. This one shows up 3 times over here. I wasn't actually aware that it did that. Let me find one that does not. What I'm trying to find is, there we go. So this is one that is not linked to a resource, accession, or digital object in this repository. It is linked, most likely, to something, one of these a record in one of these other repositories. It could also be an orphan in the system. Say something was round-tripped or taken out. If you deleted a finding aid, it leaves the agents behind because they're all siloed and they just link to each other. So it's possible to have orphaned agents. Looking at this one, you don't know if it's an orphan or if it's linked to something else in another repository. Regardless, and I know where it's linked, so I'm going to come over to the space repository, select that, and just to show you that it is linked elsewhere. And so in this one, it is linked to something. Now, if I bounce back to the YNHSC repository, if I go back to that agent, I can view it. And let's say I think it's an orphan, so I'm just going to delete it because I'm not using it in my repository. And again, you can't undo it. It will remove any references to any other records. I hit delete and it's gone. I just also removed the links to the records in the other repository. Ideally, this should give you a warning. This is linked to something else in the system. Don't delete it, or at least be really sure that you want to delete it. In this case, it does not. And I'll preference subject by saying it does the same thing. So if you only have one repository in your system, this is not a problem. But if you have multiple and it looks like something in your repository is not linked and you want to clean it up, make sure you talk to the administrators of the other repositories before you do that, or you could have some really nasty interpersonal relations in your institution. So just want to throw that out there to be very careful when deleting things in a multi-repository environment with this version. So let's take a look. We just opened one up briefly in view mode. We're going to go back to that again. And then we're going to talk about the different types of agents, the many, multiple ways of creating them, and how we link them and merge them to various records. So we have personal names. Some of these clearly have already been more fleshed out and they're coming from NACO files. If you're importing something and it's coming with a finding aid, it's not at all uncommon to have unspecified ingested source, which means there wasn't much information in the EAD XML when it was loaded in, and so it just populated this. Again, if I view it, the view, as with the other record types, will show you only the information that is filled in, not everything that is possible. And it will show you the records that it's linked to, and you can go over to them. Note there is no place here, or frankly in edit mode, where you link from the agent, or frankly subject, to the record. The link always happens from the record to the agent, and we will do that in a few minutes. And there's a reason for that, and I will explain it when we get there. So as before, you have the breadcrumbs. If I wanted to edit this record and say publish it, I could do that. Once you hit edit, of course, here are all of the potential fields that one fills in. And I can, at this point, I've made a small edit, so I'm going to go ahead and save it. If I go back to agents, so the other place you can create an agent from here, from this drop-down menu. You can create an agent from within the browse menu over here on the right. You can also create an agent from within an accession, a resource, or a digital object record. Just as Noah was showing you, you could create a digital object from within one of those records. And again, I'll point that out when we get there. I probably won't do it from that location, but I'll point it out from there. So if you're going to create a new agent, you have to decide what type of name you're creating. And I'm going to say I'm going to create a corporate body. And let's say I want to be able to publish this to the public interface. Now, as with some of the others, if you're going to add some of these fields, once you open it, again, dates all work the same way, so you have to fill in the required fields, but you may not have one. Oops, I accidentally created it rather than removing it. Remove it. Typically, the only fields that are required are a primary part of the name and either a source or a rules. The system wants you to tell it where you're deriving this name from. Now, the system comes pre-populated with a number of sources. Again, this can be updated. This is a configurable drop-down list. So you can say where it's coming from. Or it might be, so in some cases, it might be a local source, and perhaps you're using RDA to declare how you're entering these fields, or the data that you're entering, how you're structuring the data that's entering these fields. This is one, I'm actually going to go there. NACO, I happen to know that there's one in there, and I'm going to say I think it was created using those rules at the time. And before I worked for the Getty, I worked for the Texas State Library and Archives Commission. So I'm going to create a and sometimes this is one of the things that I'm hoping the new version of ArchivesSpace will help resolve. Sometimes you can have more subordinate names than ArchivesSpace has fields for. So I happen to know there's a there's one of those. And then I could save the record. So other fields that can happen occur, contact details. So the contact details might be for the person. So if I wanted to contact, the clerk of this committee, it might be the contact information for that. If this was a personal name, so say I have, Getty has the Maplethorpe records. So who would be the estate contact for the Maplethorpe estate? Who would we contact? That might go in here. It could also be the individual in question. I believe this contact details is supposed to be specific to a given repository because it can be confidential, but I would want to test that. You can add notes, but not many. The only real available note is, clearly this is still a work in progress, biographical historical note you could add, and then you could add a related agent, and I'll show you that in a second as well. The purpose of this is to eventually dump out an EAC CPF record, and there are fields in EAC CPF for related agents. So it's fairly simple to create a record from scratch. Save it. Oh, I opened it and did not enter it, and so it complained. I'm going to confirm the removal and save the corporate entity. So another couple of ways of getting them in. We've already mentioned that you can get agents in through a load of EAD XML, and some will populate. One of the better ways to get them in, though, is to use the LCNAF plugin. I'm going to sneeze. So I'm over here on this gear drop-down menu. I'm dropping down to plugins. The LCNAF import comes standard. Oh Lord, I need to go faster. And so to look up something in here, this runs out, it pulls the record from LC, and it will import it. So I'm going to look up a few names. So and you can render them in direct order or last name, comma, first name. So I've got Mark Twain. I can show the record to make sure it's the record that I want. And I'm going to scroll down a little bit. I don't know, for those of you who read Mark, there are quite a few name forms in here. There are some subjects. And if I scroll down, keep going, there are some, other terms for pseudonyms, some of the 500s. You'll note that this doesn't actually populate our agent record because in this version of ArchivesSpace, again, not all of the fields exist in ASpace to contain all of the information that's actually in one of these Mark XML records. So I'm going to select this one. I could then go back if I wanted and say, Samuel Clemens. And use this one. Again, I can scroll down the record, but I know it's that one. You notice they're lining up over here, so I can do multiple. I could also do oops, it doesn't like the partial word. House of Representatives, so I could say the Committee on County Affairs, and I could select that. I could then, once it's ready to go, hit import. It's going to go over to the background jobs and automatically start running the job. And scroll down and see it on the logon screen. When it's done, I refresh the page, and it will show me that there are 3 new records in the system, and I could then click on one to see what's come in. So this is an example of one that brings in a variety of named forms in a variety of scripts. So the system is actually fairly complex. It can handle that. Clearly, it's not linked to anything. And even though Samuel Clemens and the Mark Twain record actually kind of reference each other a little bit in the guts, they don't have any relationship in here. If I go back, I could edit this. And I could run down to related agents. And I could add a related agent, and relationship type is, let's say, well, associative is my best option here if I want to tie them together. And I could say, and save that. If I then go back into agents and sort by Clemens, you can see that this is imported. It brought in the authority ID. When it imports from LCNAF, it just brings in the authority ID, not the whole URI that you see in some other records. You can certainly put the whole URI in there if you want to. If I view this, I can see that associative relationship here. You could also do it with parent-child relationships, whether that's a literal parent-child relationship, or in the case of a corporate body, a subsidiary company or something like that. So you can do parent-child, and you can also do earlier or later forms of the name. So you have one company and it's bought out by another one, the name changes, you can say it used to be this. So you can do that as opposed to a minor name change. A different way of getting sometimes of getting things into the system, because sometimes this can break, this drop down. This LCNAF import is somewhat dependent on the link between ASpace and LC. So if LC changes something on their end, it can break this import for a certain period of time, and we've run into that. So the other way of getting data in is to come over to LC itself. And I came over here earlier and looked for the LC record for Krispy Kreme donuts. And so if I open this, if I scroll down in the LC record, there's a Mark XML format. If I click on it, and then however your browser wants you to save something, I could then save this as, I'm going to put it in. And then you can save it wherever you want it to. Make sure that it's Mark XML as an extension. I'm going to cancel this because I've already done it earlier. I'm then going to come over to ASpace, and I'm going to go to my background jobs. And we're going to cover this background jobs and importing in a lot more detail on Thursday, but it's sort of a preview. Come to background jobs, do create job, import data. Make sure that you're selecting the right thing. I'm importing an agent or subject record. So I'm going to click on that to make sure I tell the system what I'm pulling in. And I can drag the file from wherever I sent it in here, or I can go out and add it. And I don't like that file extension. It might barf. It might just need to be Mark XML, but we'll try it. Yep, nope, it was happy. There we go. I refresh it. There's Krispy Kreme donuts. And we have Krispy Kreme donuts and Donut Corporation. So one thing I want to point out is, let's say first I'm going to come back over to agents. And I'm going to go to approximately wherever my Ks are. So here is a Krispy Kreme Donut Corporation record, which is already in here, and it is linked to this Krispy Kreme resource that we have in the system. But now I have a second Krispy Kreme donuts that's actually a better record. It has more detail in it. It's definitely got the NACO authority file and the number. So let's say I want to merge these two. What's going to happen if I merge them is that it will take all the data from the one, and everything that is linked to each record will end up under the merged record. So let's say I'm going to open this, and you can do it take the record that you want to keep, open it up, and there's a merge button. And select the agent to merge into Krispy Kreme donuts. Always pay attention to this language because it can vary throughout the system, depending on where you're merging things. In this case, you're merging something into the open record. So I can search for something, and I can then merge it. It's then going to ask me to compare the two agents, and makes very clear what's going to go away and what's going to be updated. Now notice in this one, Krispy Kreme Donut Corporation is an alternate form of this name, so we're not really losing too much. And I'll show you in a minute how you can make this dominant, because this finding aid wanted this to be the form of the name that they use, and I can show you how to change that. Within this, you can replace something. So if I wanted to replace it with something else, I could. In EAD3, I think you have the option of replacing or adding. So if you had a name form here that you wanted to add to what was going to be your final record, you could do that. You can't here. So I'm going to go ahead and merge them. There's a merge preview button. And now that they are merged, it was going to take a minute, but this will update with the link from the old record. So I'm going to go out for a second. Actually, while I'm here, I'm going to go back into edit mode. And see this authorized and display name? Now before, the earlier name that we merged away from was preferencing the version of the name that had the corporation as part of the title. And so what we're going to do is, it doesn't really change color when you hover over it, but we're going to make this the display name because that's the one they wanted to have show up in that finding aid. So once I click on it, and again, it didn't change color, but the mouse becomes a different kind of pointer. So this is now the display name. You can do that if I save it. And so there's our display name. So maybe that's the authorized heading is now Krispy Kreme Donuts, but this is the preferred display name. And if I go back over to agents, there's now just one. And if I view it, there we go. Now it took it a second, but now that link came over from the old record and is here. So that will always work. Now again, it doesn't show if this is used in any other repository. It just shows the links, the things that are linked, that's linked to in this particular repository. Now let's go show you how to actually link these in a record. So I'm going to go to resources, and this works exactly the same way in resources, in agents, and in digital objects. And I'm going to go to diaries of famous people. I'm going to edit that. And so let's say in my agent links, I want to add an agent. And again, this is where you add them. You add them from within these records, not from the agent or the subject side. I'm going to get to subjects. I do have time. I'm going to get there shortly. So if you notice, when we created those agents, we said nothing whatsoever about whether that agent was a creator, a source, a subject, or anything like that. We just made a record for that corporate body or for that personal name. We could have done it for family or software as well. The reason that's the case is because any of these names could potentially have different roles in different finding aids. So you could even have, for example, Samuel Clemens could be the source and the creator of these diaries. So it could be in here twice with different roles. Could be in a different finding aid with different roles. So the role is assigned when you link it within your major descriptive record. And I hope that makes sense. Again, it will vary. So for example, I'm going to say in this case, it's a creator. And you could use the relator terms if you need to. I actually have a style sheet that keys off of some of these. And it could be a creator, it could be a compiler, it could be, again, these are. And then in agents, I can search to find one. And by typing ahead, I could use the drop down to browse. Or as Noah was showing with digital objects, you could create one from scratch within the context of this record. If I were to do that, again, these are exactly the same fields that you see if you were creating it within the agents module. But we're not going to do that here in the interest of time, but you could. So I'm going to say Clemens. And these are coming up because they do have that associative relationship that I established. If you actually look at the Sam Clemens record, it says don't use this one as a subject, use Mark Twain. So we're going to follow that. And I'm going to say maybe these diaries, maybe he was the source, he donated them perhaps. And they're about him. As I recall from some biography, and a lot of things were about him. So I'm going to add this, and this time I'm going to show you browse. And I could search down to find them, or I could do Twain, link to agents. Because it's a subject, he's in here as a subject. He's when a person or a corporate body is used as a subject, their record is still in the agent. But when you give it the role of subject, you have terms and subdivisions that you can add. So in this case, I'm going to say Mark Twain. The term this is actually a free-floating subdivision, humor, and it's I believe it's a subfield V, which makes it a former genre. So I can add this. If I save it, I now have 3 agent links. I could add more. I could say maybe we have a diary for J. Paul as well. So that's how you would link it. You can see, actually, if you were to say, if you were to go to export, again, we'll show you this more tomorrow, and dump out a MARC record of this top level digital object, digital object resource. This is opening up in Oxygen. So here you can see the one that I'm tagged as a creator is here. Here is my Mark Twain with my code subfield V for humor. Also creator in some of these. In this case, J. Paul Getty isn't actually fielded properly in the system, but Mark Twain is, so it does field properly here when it dumps out in Mark. And that's, again, just to show you, we'll get into more exports tomorrow. So that's how you can create a couple different methods of importing or creating agent records, how you link them to resources, and how you might merge them to clean them up in the system, which is, I think, all I have time to talk about for now, because I do need to move on to subjects. And as I've hinted along the way, subjects work much the same way. So they usually get somewhat short shrift when we do discussions of them. As before, you can create them over here, or you can browse for them. The creation methods are fundamentally the same. Oftentimes they can come in when you're importing EAD XML. You can create them from scratch, and you can use the plugin to find them. If you're using this plugin to find them, just pick the LCSH, and it'll bring back a bunch of headings. What it will bring back are the base headings. It doesn't bring back subfields. So if you're importing something, all you're importing and all your identifier number is going to be associated with is this base field. So I'm going to, I'm just going to bring in art museums. Again, it works the same way. It knows it's topical. If I were to edit, it didn't bring in the authority ID for some reason. It has done that in the past. I haven't seen it do that, but it should bring in the authority ID. So if we go back to subjects, though, there are a couple of things you might notice. If one's built correctly in the system, I'm going to open this top one, abolitionists in view. This is how it should work. It should be broken up among terms. And I'm going to look at this and edit briefly. And so you can add terms and subdivisions on the way down. The type will actually dump out with the appropriate subfield associated with it. So this is the way it should work. What can happen when you bring them in with EAD is that you get something that looks more like this, which is a single string. And this is not the way the system is intended to work, but things can import this way. So as a cleanup project, I would do this, states, and that would be geographic. I would add 20th century, which and that would be temporal, and I would get rid of that. So up here, it looks the same, but down here, it's actually done correctly and will field appropriately when dumped out in MARC. So if we were going to create one from scratch, and as before, you can do it from this create drop-down menu. You can do it from the create subject within the browse screen, or you could do it from within a resource record or an agent, resource, session, or digital object. I'm going to go back to, I'm actually going to do this within an accession record. And I'll go back to my family papers and I'll edit that. And I could add a subject if I wanted to. In this case, I'm going to create it. And my source is actually, I'm pretty sure this is in Library of Congress. I could go out and find the authority ID for it and put it in. The authority ID, again, only governs the top term, but I could go, dogs, Mr. Getty liked his dogs. Topical, add. I could not capitalize that. And I believe this is correct. If I create it and link it to subject, I now have a record linked here, and it has simultaneously created it. If I go back to browse, oops, and so I did not save the record. Save the record in addition to creating the subject. Back to browse, go to subjects, and I'll search for, again, this also has filters. So it could be by the source or the term type. And this, again, I think references the top term. So it created it here and has the link to the record. And as before, if I went to a different repository, if you're in a multi-repository instance and you go to subjects, you see dogs. If you view it, looks like it's not associated with anything. In fact, it is. It's just elsewhere. So again, don't delete something that looks like an orphan without checking with your colleagues, just in the interest of multi-repository happiness. I'm going to bounce back over. So I think that you can, I will say you can merge them. Sometimes, again, you can get a couple of terms in if you load in something through one of the import processes and something comes in through an EAD import, you can have two. So I could say, whether I'm in view or edit, I could merge it, and in this case, select something to merge into bacteria. I could do bacterial genetics. Say I wanted it to be more general. You cannot see if it's linked to anything while you're in edit mode, but if it is, then the same things relink just as they did with the agents. So if I merge it, again, warning, can't really undo this. Everything will be relinked. Go ahead and merge. There is no comparison as there was with agents because this is such a simple process. So it just automatically merges once you hit the button. And then this is what was linked. If anything else was, it might take a minute or two to refresh so that you'll see it here. So I didn't run over. I might have gone a little bit too fast there for a few minutes, so I would be happy to repeat anything on agents or subjects, or if I know it or Jessica realized that I missed something, I'm happy to go back and cover that. Any questions about this part?
All right, yeah, thanks, Nancy. Yeah, at first I was like, this is going to be a nail biter, and then you just blew through it, so that's awesome.
It might have been a little bit too fast, so I apologize. I saw the clock out of the corner of my eye and went, oops.
Noah's been going through and answering questions. There have been questions. So if you asked a question, it has been answered by Noah, but a couple things I want to just reiterate. So we did get the question about agents. If you merge agents, will they be merged across repositories? So just to reiterate that agent and subject records are shared across repositories. So anything you do to one of those records will impact the record for all repositories.
Yep.
Noah answered this as well, but just I think it's also worth pointing out again, the role of an agent as subject is not a subject, they are still an agent. So is it mandatory to create a subject subdivision after an agent whose role is subject? No,
it is not. I only showed it because sometimes people see that term in subdivision underneath and then become a little confused. Like, what am I really supposed to, is it really a subject? Am I supposed to do that? So that's how it works if you need it. But if you don't need it, don't use it.
I think that point, Jessica, is really important to emphasize, though, that I think Nancy said this, but if you are linking a name to a record, an agent, even if it only has a subject relationship. So say like you have a collection about Mark Twain, you're not going to add Mark Twain as a subject. You still create an agent record for Mark Twain and you link his agent record using the role of subject.
Yeah.
So what you don't want to do is like create an agent record for him and then also create a subject record for him. And then those two things are like separate entities. You should only use the subject module for sort of topical subjects, geographical subjects, and genres. And I can't remember what the other types are. They're not to be used for names. Sometimes this happened to us when we imported a bunch of data from EAD, people had created names as subjects. And so you might end up with names in your subject module if you're importing data. But, if you're creating them from scratch in ArchivesSpace, best to avoid it.
These are the types of the subdivisions. And again, so it's a genre form term. So if you were dumping it out as Mark, so for example, as this one is albums, this should be a 655 in Mark. If this were a different type of heading and top level and it was topical, it would come out as a 650. So, and then some of these would be subdivisions under that. So you would have, in that earlier example, I think we had the, I don't say anything. We had with, say, dogs. If it were dumping out as Mark, it would be a 650 for dogs. I think it would be what, a subfield X. I'm going to mix up my subfields and please bear with me. I apologize. I'm garbling them now. I think it'd be a subfield X for law and legislation and the subfields Y or Z. I'm liking for the geographic terms. So that's how they would dump out in Mark, and that's why they're fielded that way, and that's what those subdivisions are based on.
Thanks.
I should say that you can link any subject or agent to any level of a digital object or a resource. So if you want to add agent and subject links to a series, to a archival object at any level, you can do that. How they display will depend on your style sheet that's embedded in the back end of ASpace, but that's configurable. If you are dumping out MARC, know that MARC only dumps out from the top level of a resource. So you can't dump out a MARC record for a series in your resource, and the names linked at the series in your resource will not dump out in the MARC record. The MARC record is purely based off the main level resource and what is linked to that.
All right, thank you to you both. A couple people have said that it's clear that agents that are subjects should still be linked as agents, but I think that probably Noah and I have both had the same data cleanup project, because that is very important to reiterate, because it is miserable to have to fix.
Yeah, I've seen too where we are.
Yeah, you can't merge agent and subject records like you can merge, you know, two agents or two subjects. You can't merge across types.
One other question that Noah did answer, but just to say it out loud, can you add an additional source to that drop-down list? So Noah did say yes, you can add additional source vocabularies to the source drop-down value list. And I think that is something we're going to go over on Thursday, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we'll cover that.
It's up here, and if anyone wants to play with it before then, it's up here in System under Manage Controlled Value Lists, and then you would look for the particular which would be link engine roles, name rule, name source. So the rules, for example. But you can create values and add them. Sorry, now I'm stealing Noah's thunder. I'm sorry. I'll stop.
It's just a little teaser for Thursday.
There we go.
Just to get everyone excited. All right, I think we're all caught up on questions about subjects and agents. Any other questions in general? We can, of course, give you 10 minutes back to your day. But if there are any other questions, maybe about digital objects that you didn't get a chance to ask, or anything else, please feel free to go ahead and drop those into the Q&A now. In the meantime, I'll keep an eye on that. But in the meantime, we do have one more session together. Our last session will be Thursday, same time, same Zoom. And you do have one final set of homework assignments that you have the opportunity to complete. This is sort of a longer list of exercises. So the first thing that we're asking you to do is to build a simple digital object, and the instructions for that are on page 91 of your workbook. There's a second exercise to build a complex digital object. That's on page 95 of your workbook. That's optional because we know that we are asking you to do a lot, but if you want to take a stab at building a complex digital object, please do that. That's on page 95. And then we do have an exercise to create an agent record and an exercise to create a subject record. Those are on pages 106 and 112 of your workbook. So please do take the opportunity to try those exercises out to get a feel for them. And if you have any questions, go ahead and use that form on your agenda, that feedback form, to ask those questions, or you can bring them to the homework recap when we get back together on Thursday, but we will answer any questions submitted via the form first. So if you have a burning question, please be sure you submit it via the form. I'm not seeing any other questions coming through in the chat or in the Q&A. So we're going to go ahead and wrap it up for today. Give everyone their 10 minutes back because it was a lot of different content covered today. We probably could use it. So thank you everybody for coming. Thank you for a great beginning to our second week together. And thank you to Nancy and Noah for being here and fielding all of our questions. I look forward to seeing you all again on Thursday. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.